In the heart of southern Africa in the year 1879, the air was thick with tension as two powerful forces stood on the brink of war: the mighty Zulu kingdom with its proud warrior tradition and the expanding British Empire with its eyes fixed on dominion over the region. It was a collision of two vastly different worlds: the disciplined tribal structure of the Zulu and the industrialized machinery of Victorian England. The roots of the conflict stretched back years, tied to British colonial ambitions, the annexation of neighboring territories, and a desire to consolidate control over southern Africa through a confederation system similar to what had been used in Canada. The British saw the Zulu kingdom as an obstacle in the path of that plan, and they were determined to eliminate it. At the center of the brewing storm was King Cetshwayo, the ruler of the Zulu nation, whose disciplined regiments known as Amabuto were trained in traditional warfare based on speed, stealth, and sheer courage. The Zulu nation under Cetshwayo was not aggressive but defensive. It wished only to be left in peace to govern its people and maintain its sovereignty. But the British had other intentions, their representatives in the region particularly. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, sought to provoke a confrontation. Frere believed that a show of British power was necessary to ensure control over the region, and he used the pretext of a border skirmish to issue an ultimatum to King Cetshwayo. The demands were intentionally unacceptable, aimed at forcing the Zulu king to refuse them. Among the terms was the disbanding of the Zulu army, a clear dismantling of the nation's independence and its defense capabilities. Cetshwayo had no choice but to reject the ultimatum, triggering the start of a war that would be remembered for both its brutality and its irony. The British believed they would crush the Zulus swiftly, underestimating their strength, resilience, and strategic brilliance. The first British forces to cross the Tugela River into Zululand in January 1879 were confident, proud, and poorly prepared for what lay ahead. Led by Lord Chelmsford, the invasion force split into columns, a strategy that would soon prove disastrous. Among these, the central column marched towards the Zulu heartland, unaware that a force of 20,000 Zulu warriors moved silently through the grasslands towards a rocky outcrop known as Isandlwana. It was here that one of the most shocking defeats in British military history would unfold. As the British made camp at the base of the mountain on January 22nd, they failed to entrench or fortify their position, certain that the Zulu would not attack. Without provocation, the soldiers set up tents, unpacked supplies, and waited. The terrain seemed open, and the British rifles and artillery were believed to be superior to any threat from native forces. But that morning, a storm of spears and war cries descended from the hills. In a perfectly coordinated attack, the Zulu regiments overwhelmed the scattered British lines using the classic buffalo horns formation. The Zulu center pinned the British front while the flanks enveloped them from both sides. Within hours, over 1,300 British and colonial troops lay dead, a devastating loss that sent shockwaves through the empire. The Zulus suffered heavy losses too, but their victory at Isandlwana proved that they were not to be dismissed or underestimated. It was a wake-up call for London and a moment of profound pride and sorrow for the Zulu people. The battle became a symbol of indigenous resistance, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humbled by courage and strategy. King Cetshwayo, however, did not pursue the victory. He hoped that a single demonstration of strength would lead the British to negotiate and withdraw. Instead, it only hardened British resolve and set the stage for further bloodshed across the hills and valleys of Zululand. In the days following the crushing British defeat at Isandlwana, panic swept through the colonial settlements across Natal. The unthinkable had happened. A European army had been annihilated by an indigenous force, and the image of British invincibility was shattered. Newspapers in London exploded with headlines, crying out for vengeance and reinforcements. The public demanded answers, and the military scrambled to save face and reassert control as British forces reeled from the loss. Another drama was unfolding at a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, located near the border of Natal and Zululand. It became the site of one of the most famous last stands in military history, just hours after the fall of Isandlwana. A force of over 4,000 Zulu warriors turned their attention toward Rorke's Drift, where a mere 150 British soldiers stood behind makeshift barricades, with no time to retreat and no hope for outside help. The defenders prepared for the onslaught. They stacked mealie bags and biscuit boxes to form walls and awaited the storm. The battle that followed raged for 12 hours through the night, with wave after wave of Zulu warriors charging the defenses. In the flickering light of lanterns and gunfire, the redcoats held firm. The narrow perimeter, the superior firepower, and the sheer desperation of the defenders kept the attackers at bay. By dawn, the Zulu withdrew, leaving behind hundreds of their dead and wounded Rorkes. Drift became a symbol of British heroism and resilience. Even as Isandlwana loomed as a reminder of colonial arrogance, the defenders were awarded more Victoria Crosses than any other single engagement in British history, and the public clung to the tale as a balm for the earlier humiliation. Yet the war was far from over. As reinforcements arrived from England and local colonies, Lord Chelmsford pushed forward, determined to defeat the Zulu and restore the honor of the empire. He was aware, however, that his command was under scrutiny and he needed a decisive victory. The second invasion of Zululand was meticulously planned, with better logistics, tighter formations, and more caution. The British now respected the discipline and bravery of their enemy and no longer assumed an easy victory. Meanwhile, King Cetshwayo was trapped between hope and devastation. He had not wanted war, and despite his initial success, he sent repeated messages to the British requesting peace. His envoys were often ignored or dismissed as British pride demanded retribution, not reconciliation. With the British advance pressing deeper into Zululand, the Zulu forces found themselves stretched thin. Unlike the British, they lacked a continuous supply of ammunition and modern weapons, and the sheer attrition of warfare was beginning to take its toll. In skirmishes across the rolling hills, the Zulu fought with unmatched bravery, but each battle chipped away at their strength. The British began to establish fortified positions and supply lines, making it increasingly difficult for the Zulu to launch effective counterattacks. Still, the spirit of the warriors endured. They fought not for conquest, but for their homeland, for their family, and for the right to remain sovereign against a foreign invader. As the war escalated, the British constructed a series of strategic outposts and began implementing scorched earth tactics, destroying kraals, crops, and resources to starve the Zulu. Resistance into submission. The cost to the civilian population was immense, as villages were razed and families displaced. The conflict was no longer about one battle or one king. It had become a campaign of total dominance. The eyes of the empire watched as the final confrontation drew near, and in the heart of Zululand, King Cetshwayo prepared for the inevitable reckoning. By the middle of 1879, the British military had fully regrouped, and their resolve was steel-sharp. Thousands of reinforcements had arrived from England, along with heavier artillery, better logistics, and experienced commanders. The memory of Isandlwana haunted the officers, and every step into Zululand was now taken with calculated caution. King Cetshwayo still hoped for a diplomatic resolution, but the time for talk had passed. His messengers bearing white flags and pleas for peace were met with silence or imprisoned. The British were no longer merely fighting a campaign. They were executing an imperial mission to crush an indigenous kingdom and erase any threat to colonial supremacy. The heart of the Zulu army still beat strong, but their supplies were dwindling, and their warriors were stretched thin from months of marching and fighting across scorched earth. Despite their legendary bravery, the warriors now faced not only exhaustion and hunger, but the relentless pressure of an enemy that had learned from its early mistakes. The final confrontation was drawing near, and both sides prepared for the battle that would determine the future of Zululand. At a place called Ulundi, the last stand was set. It was the royal capital of the Zulu nation, a place Of symbolic and strategic importance, Lord Chelmsford knew that destroying Ulundi would deliver a psychological blow from which the Zulu might never recover. King Cetshwayo, aware of the danger, concentrated his forces and prepared to defend his homeland to the last breath. On the morning of July 4th, 1879, the British formed a massive square of men, artillery, and mounted troops and marched toward Ulundi. The Zulu warriors, numbering nearly 20,000, assembled in traditional formation. Armed with spears, cowhide shields, and a limited number of rifles collected from fallen enemies and traitors, their chants rose like thunder across the plain, their feet beating the earth in unison as they prepared for the battle that would define their legacy. The British square advanced with grim precision, every rifle loaded, every cannon ready to roar. As the Zulu army surged forward, the British unleashed a storm of bullets and shells. The disciplined firepower of the square was overwhelming, and the warriors, though fearless, were cut down by the hundreds. Still, they pressed on, flanking and probing the square, seeking any weakness. They reached the bayonets and cannon wheels in some places, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. But the fire never stopped. The square held, and the Zulu charge faltered, then broke. By midday, the battlefield was a scarred plain littered with the fallen. The British lost fewer than 100 men, while over 1,500 Zulu lay dead or dying. The destruction of Ulundi followed, and with it, the symbolic end of the Zulu kingdom. King Cetshwayo fled into the wilderness, eventually captured by British forces and exiled to Cape Town. The once proud capital was reduced to ash, and the spirit of a sovereign nation was shattered. Yet even in defeat, the Zulu people maintained their dignity and pride. The British declared victory and installed puppet chiefs to rule under their supervision, marking the beginning of indirect rule in Zululand. Though the war had ended, the occupation began, and the land that once thrived under the leadership of its own kings was now fragmented under colonial control. Back in London, the government received the news of Ulundi with mixed emotions. The war had cost lives, resources, and political capital, and many questioned the morality of such an aggressive campaign. Parliament debated the ethics of empire, while newspapers celebrated the triumph of civilization over savagery. The people of England were fed stories of heroism, duty, and glory, while the suffering of the Zulu remained largely unseen. The Zulu War became a case study in the cost of imperial ambition. The early defeat at Isandlwana had exposed the vulnerability of arrogance, while the massacre at Ulundi illustrated the brutality of industrial warfare against a traditional society. King Cetshwayo would eventually be allowed to visit England, where he was received with curiosity and even sympathy by the British public. Many were surprised to meet a man of intelligence, dignity, and honor, so different from the savage caricature often painted in colonial propaganda. His presence challenged the simplistic narrative of good versus evil, and forced some to reflect on the human cost of conquest. But his journey ended in sorrow, as he was never fully restored to power, and the kingdom he once ruled remained under colonial shadow. The legacy of the Zulu War endured not only in the ruins of Ulundi and the graves of soldiers, but in the spirit of resistance that would later inspire future generations. Across southern Africa, the name of Cetshwayo was remembered not as a defeated king, but as a symbol of courage and sovereignty. The Zulu people, though broken by war, remained unbowed, and their story became part of a broader narrative of African resistance against European imperialism. The war had ended on the battlefield, but its echoes would ring for decades in the halls of power, the fields of Zululand, and the hearts of those who still believed in the right to self-determination. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield at Ulundi and the British flag was raised over the ashes of the Zulu capital, the empire declared victory, but the scars of the war remained raw across the land. While London celebrated the triumph of civilization, the people of Zululand mourned their fallen warriors and watched their homeland torn apart by colonial restructuring. The British administration began dividing the Zulu territory into 13 chiefdoms installing rulers who were either loyal to British interests or too weak to resist orders, came down from the colonial office to dismantle the central authority of the Zulu kingdom, ensuring no leader would rise again with the power of King Cetshwayo. This fragmentation created confusion, rivalry, and unrest among the Zulu people who had once stood united under a single banner. As taxes were imposed, land was seized, and foreign law enforced. Resentment simmered below the surface. British settlers poured into the region, claiming farms and grazing land, while missionaries set up schools and churches to reshape Zulu culture according to European standards. The British believed they were civilizing a savage land, but, in reality, they were dismantling a proud society and replacing it with a system that served the needs of empire, not the people who lived there. King Cetshwayo, meanwhile, remained in exile, closely watched by colonial officials, but his voice refused to be silenced. Letters written in his own hand continued to circulate among supporters, calling for the restoration of his kingdom and urging unity among his people. In 1882, after years of lobbying by sympathizers and public figures in Britain, Cetshwayo was granted permission to travel to London. His arrival sparked fascination across the city. He was met not as a defeated warlord, but as a foreign dignitary. His stature and poise impressed even his enemies, and his appeals for justice found sympathetic ears in Parliament and the press. He argued not for revenge, but for restoration, asking simply to return home and rule in peace over his people. The British government agreed to his request, and in 1883, King Cetshwayo was allowed to return to a portion of his former territory. But what awaited him was not the kingdom he had once known. Zululand was now a fractured land plagued by civil war. Between those loyal to Cetshwayo and those empowered by British rule, the conflict deepened. Brother turned against brother, and the dream of unity faded into bloodshed. Cetshwayo himself was the target of an assassination attempt in 1883, severely wounded and forced into hiding. He would die the following year in February 1884, his body broken, but his spirit still revered by his people. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a deeper struggle for identity, justice, and memory. Among the British public, the Zulu War gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by other imperial exploits in Sudan, Egypt, and India. But among historians, politicians, and writers, debate continued over the necessity and morality of the war. Some argued it was a tragic consequence of miscommunication and cultural misunderstanding. Others saw it as an inevitable clash between expansionist empire and indigenous sovereignty. Still others viewed it as a calculated move by colonial authorities to eliminate any threat to British supremacy in southern Africa. The truth lay somewhere in between. The Zulu War was neither a glorious campaign nor a simple accident of history. It was a deliberate assertion of power, a demonstration of how the machinery of empire operated and how quickly it could destroy what it did not understand. The military lessons learned at Isandlwana influenced British tactics in future colonial wars, while the legacy of Ulundi reminded future generals of the cost of underestimating their enemies. In South Africa, the legacy of the war endured in the landscape, the oral traditions, and the identity of the Zulu people. Monuments and memorials rose on battlefields, but it was in the songs and stories passed down through generations that the memory truly lived. Warriors who had fought and died were honored in praise poetry, and their names became symbols of resistance and pride. Even those who had surrendered or collaborated were remembered not as traitors, but as victims of a greater political storm beyond their control. For the Zulu, the war was not just a military conflict, it was a defining moment in their struggle for autonomy and dignity. For the British, it was a chapter of imperial history marked by both humiliation and triumph, and one that revealed the contradictions at the heart of their empire-building project. In classrooms across England, the story of Rorke's Drift was taught as a shining example of courage, while Isandlwana was treated with caution if acknowledged at all. The complexities of the war were often simplified or ignored, especially the role of imperial provocation and the destruction of a functioning African kingdom in pursuit of control, trade, and expansion. It would take generations before a fuller picture emerged, shaped by voices from both sides of the conflict. The Zulu War did not end with a clean resolution, or a treaty signed under grand chandeliers, but with silence, ash and disarray strewn across the grasslands of southern Africa. The once unified Zulu kingdom was broken, its political structures dismantled, its spiritual heart damaged, yet the story was far from over. The impact of England's role in this war continued to ripple across decades, transforming not only the people of Zululand, but reshaping the imperial psyche that had long considered its mission noble and divine. For the Zulu people, the legacy of the war lived on in every family who had lost a son, every homestead burned, and every tradition disrupted by foreign interference. Stories were passed down in hushed voices, around fires retelling the courage of the warrior who stood at Isandlwana, the defiance of King Cetshwayo, and the anguish that followed the fall of Ulundi. British colonial administrators who remained in the region tried to mask the destruction with policy reforms, mission schools, and trade initiatives, but they could not erase the memory of conquest or rebuild what had been deliberately broken. In England, the war was repackaged as a military adventure, highlighting valor and exotic encounters, while concealing the cruelty behind imperial motives. The names of Chelmsford and Frere remained controversial among military historians. Some praised their tenacity, others condemned their provocations that had dragged the empire into a war that need not have happened. Meanwhile, the men who had fought in Zululand returned to Britain with medals and trauma alike, many never speaking of the horrors they witnessed in those endless green fields where they faced warriors who believed death was preferable to defeat. Over time, the Zulu War became part of a broader imperial narrative that included India-Sudan and the Boer republics. It was taught as a lesson in discipline logistics and the risks of underestimating indigenous forces. Yet what was rarely emphasized was the question that haunted thoughtful observers from the beginning. What right did the empire have to impose its will on a sovereign people who had never asked to be part of it? What justification could be offered for dismantling a kingdom not because it posed a threat, but because it refused to bend to outside control? The deeper moral questions were buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, church sermons, and museum exhibits filled with Zulu artifacts taken as trophies. But in Zululand, the memory remained raw long after. The last British soldier had returned home. For decades, resistance movements simmered among the people, some openly protesting British rule, others working silently to preserve their culture, language, and story. During the early 20th century, as the British Empire expanded and then slowly unraveled the example of the Zulu resistance-inspired leaders across the African continent, the tale of how a proud kingdom stood firm against the most powerful military force of its time became a symbol of defiance for those living under colonial rule. In schools across South Africa, children learned about Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, and began to ask difficult questions about their own history and the legacies of conquest and resistance. The legend of King Cetshwayo grew with each passing generation, not only as a warrior king, but as a symbol of dignity, intelligence, and unwillingness to submit, even in the face of annihilation. His name was spoken with reverence in rural villages and urban centers alike, not because he won the war, but because he carried the spirit of his people with honor to the very end. Even when exiled, humiliated, and wounded, he did not betray his land or compromise his integrity. That example endured long after colonial officials had changed hands and flags had been lowered. In the post-colonial era, the Zulu War was re-examined through a new lens, no longer filtered through imperial arrogance, but with a focus on the human cost of Empire African. Scholars, poets, and historians unearthed forgotten testimonies and oral traditions, reclaiming the narrative from archives and textbooks that had once told the story only from the viewpoint of redcoats and British lords. Films, documentaries, and Novels brought the voices of Zulu warriors, women, and children into the spotlight, and the story evolved from a tale of military tactics into one of cultural survival. The world came to understand that the war was not a clash of barbarism and civilization, but a confrontation between two nations, each with its own values, leaders, and visions for the future. In modern South Africa, the battlefields of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift have become places of pilgrimage, not just for tourists, but for descendants of those who fought and died on both sides. The rolling hills whisper stories in the wind, and monuments now honor both the fallen Zulu and British soldiers who gave their lives in a war driven by politics, greed, and fear. The land remembers even. When governments forget, museums and memorials have begun to tell a more balanced story, not just of bravery, but of betrayal of leadership and loss of the cost of imperial ambition and the resilience of those who resisted it. School children walk those paths where warriors once ran, and they ask how such a tragedy could have happened and what it means for their future. In England, too, the war has been revisited by a new generation of historians, journalists, and educators who seek to understand the full truth of what happened in 1879. They examine the letters of officers, the drawings of missionaries, the songs of Zulu, women waiting for sons who never returned. They study not just the battles, but the minds and hearts of those who fought, them and the system that created such conflicts in the first place. The Zulu War stands today as more than a historical episode. It is a mirror reflecting the power dynamics of empire, the dangers of arrogance, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. It shows what happens when negotiation is replaced with force, when diplomacy is used as a weapon, and when cultural superiority blinds a nation to the wisdom of others. England's role in southern Africa is forever tied to this war, to the loss of life, and to the shattering of a nation whose only desire was to live in peace and sovereignty. And yet from that darkness rose a legacy of resilience. From the ashes of Ulundi came a voice that still speaks truth to power, reminding the world that no matter how overwhelming the odds, the fight for dignity, freedom, and justice can never be fully extinguished. The Zulu War may have ended in the history books, but in the hearts of those who carry its memory, the story continues. As a call to honor the past and build a more just and honest future.